everyone responds to rules differently. You might push back on every single rule just because you can. Or you might be the kind of person who just goes with the flow and you find it really easy to obey almost every rule. And no matter how you deal with rules, at some point you're going to face a rule that you really don't like or a rule that makes you feel trapped or caged. And one of the most frustrating things about being a teenager, about being your age, is that you still oftentimes find yourself feeling stuck between childhood and adulthood, between dependence and independence, between rules and freedom. And you might be ready for more freedom, but there's still a lot of rules or adults that you have to obey in the meantime. So what do we do about rules that we don't really want to follow, rules that we don't really agree with or believe in, or that we really don't see what the big deal is about them? How do we handle our frustration when we want to be free right now? And to make matters worse, if you're a follower of Jesus, a lot of Christians think the Bible just reinforces the idea that we have to get in line and follow a bunch of stupid rules. When some people think about God, what comes to their mind is a long list of rules, like a mile long, that just don't feel that important, or rules that are irrelevant to our lives. And I completely get that feeling in that position. Especially during your teenage years, this can be really frustrating when you're fighting for your freedom and your independence, and it seems like God is just one more person who's telling you what to do and how to live. So what does the Bible actually have to say about following rules? We're going to meet a character from the Bible named James. And James is an important person. He wrote a book of the Bible that has a lot to say about rules. Oh, and by the way, James had a really famous brother, Jesus. This was actually Jesus's half-brother. So after Jesus rose from the dead, James starts telling everyone the good news about Jesus. And he even became a leader in the early church at Jerusalem, a community that was made up of previously Jewish religious people who had begun following Jesus. So James grew up in a culture that had a lot of rules, like a ton of rules, a lot more than like we even really imagine sometimes. And some of these rules were obvious, like don't kill people. But other rules, hundreds of these rules, were things like don't wear clothes that are made up of two types of fabric. And if you find an ox on the side of the road, stop what you're doing and take it back to the owner immediately. Or say goodbye to eating shrimp and bacon because these foods were considered unclean. And it may seem weird that God would give us all these kind of rules, but these rules had a purpose for the people. Some of these rules kept the Hebrew people, the people who were practicing the Old Testament religion, safe and healthy. Others set them apart from other nations and religious practices. Some taught them how to live at peace with each other. And many of these rules helped the people connect more deeply with God. These rules served a purpose, but after Jesus showed up, people who were following Jesus began to realize how dramatically Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection had really changed things for them. Because Jesus had made things right between them and God, they weren't expected and required to follow a lot of these rules anymore. Or were they? See, this was a big tension, a big discussion, a big debate in the early Christian movement. So James wrote a letter to help followers of Jesus process this. And this is what he says in his letter in James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in the mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of freedom, and has continued in it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an active doer, this person will be blessed in what he does. So let's break down what James says here. First thing he says is, do what God says. Now, James doesn't say, shut up and do as you're told, although a lot of us may hear it that way if we're used to being told what to do a lot. He also isn't telling us we have to immediately stop eating bacon because that doesn't seem to be the kind of rules that he's talking about here. So we have to ask ourselves, what rules does James mean? What law is James actually talking about? The second thing he says is that God's word helps us see ourselves more clearly, like a mirror. So we have to ask ourselves, how is it that God's law helps us see ourselves more clearly? The third thing he says here is that following God's law gives us freedom. Well, how is that even possible? How in the world is it that we can follow rules and not feel trapped by them, controlled by them? How in the world can God's laws set us free? Well, the law that James is talking about is not a list of hundreds of laws that people had to follow for so long. When Jesus was still on earth, he reimagined what it meant to follow God. Jesus one time was being interrogated by religious leaders who really loved rules, so much so that a lot of times your translations of the Bible will call them lawyers. These leaders would tear apart every detail of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and give the people specific ways, specific rules and regulations that they needed to follow, every specific detail of, in order to, in their mind, honor God. This is what it says in Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question, testing him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments hang the whole law and prophets. See, Jesus summarized God's law with this: love God and love others as yourself. That's it. Love God and love others as yourself. And when Jesus said all the law hangs on these two commandments, what he's really saying is that if you truly love God and you love others the way that you love yourself, you're already following God's law. So when we love God and love others, it means that we learn that we don't have to do anything else to keep God's law, that God still loves us because we're already loved by God, even though we're sometimes imperfect in the way we follow him. And we're doing what God says. We're truly following God's law. Love is how we do something. It's how we become doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. And when we love God and love other people, we begin to see ourselves more clearly. Just like a mirror, the command to love God and to love others shows us how we're following God's law. And when we begin to practice this law of love, loving God and loving others, we actually find freedom. The religious leaders at the time believed that you and I had to follow hundreds of rules meticulously down to the very detail in order for God to love us and to accept us. But Jesus came to free us from that. So what does it look like for us to live this out in our everyday lives? Well, if we're going to love others, there's a lot of rules that make us feel restricted. They seem unreasonable and unfair. But what if we thought about these rules a little differently? What if instead of telling your parents that curfew is stupid, we asked ourselves, how can I love my parents better? Maybe come home earlier lets us go to sleep instead of staying up late, and they won't be worried about us, wondering if we're safe. What if instead of thinking, man, it's fine to text while I drive, we asked ourselves, how can I better love the people on the road around me? Following these laws is a simple way to protect ourselves and other people from harm. And instead of deciding that the church is wrong and that the way I treat people in my relationships and the choices I make in my relationships aren't that big of a deal, what if we said, what does it really mean to truly love the people I date? Maybe loving someone means being kind and selfless, patient and wise, rather than doing things that we want to do in the heat of the moment. And what about loving God? See, Jesus' rule of loving others is a helpful way to help us make decisions, no matter what you believe. But Jesus gave us the law of love for a reason that's much bigger than that. Above all else, Jesus wants us to love God. So if following God makes you free instead of feeling caged in, you're going to ask yourself, how do God's rules help me love God more? How do they help me stay close to God? How do they give me a chance to love God by loving other people? How do they give me a chance to trust God, even when I don't really understand all the complexities of what's going on? And over the next few weeks, we're going to talk a lot about the relationship between rules and freedom, but we need to start right here with the law of love. God's law sets us free to love others, to love ourselves, and to love God. God's law helps us to see that no matter what we've done, God's love never fails us. And although there will be rules that we don't like, rules that we don't understand, rules we don't agree with, the right rules can set us free. And according to Jesus, the greatest rule is love.